Welcome. We're pleased to introduce yet again renowned physicist Dr. Jeremy England, former professor of physics at MIT, author of Every Life is on Fire, and currently a machine learning researcher in the biotech industry here in Israel. Dr. England.
Thanks very much. So obviously the title of the talk today is somewhat peculiar or provocative or zany, but I think it actually is a combined topic that I'm going to try to take seriously, but we're going to have to build it up out of the text in a way where it makes sense to talk about these two things together. Because clearly, at the outset, speaking about dinosaurs and on the one hand, and the priesthood descended from Aaron, the brother of Moshe, on the other, doesn't really make sense, why you would talk about these two things together. And even if you try to reach for an idea of why you would, I don't think it should be at all obvious. It's certainly not something I came to the text expecting, but I think what I did try to think about a bit is, if I were to try to look for things that the Torah is trying to teach us about how to think about the question of dinosaurs and what their material evidence in the presence could mean for our understanding of the world, what sources would I look at? And then once you start laying them side by side, you start just seeing connections between them. And I think ultimately what I hope I can establish, and it's going to be a bit of a zany ride through different sources, but I hope what I can establish is that the peculiarity of the juxtaposition of these two topics is actually the answer to the other thing, which very easy to think that, of course, any text that seeks to teach us about the world and what it is and make reference to the distant past must, of course, have something to say about that. But you have to pose a question to yourself in the following way. If I view the Torah not as some dry, blow-by-blow forensic account of every minute since the beginning of the universe, and if I view it not as an encyclopedia of scientific discoveries that will eventually be made by humankind, but rather I view it as a way of characterizing the world in language that will enable the Oved Hashem, the servant of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to make good choices in the world about how to act on the course of that mission, to learn and study the Torah and serve the creator of the world who gave it to us. If I view the Torah as having those intentions or that purpose, then why would it need to talk about dinosaurs at all? What's the point of that, right? It, I think, should at least be a question why it should be of interest at all to ask what happened 100,000 years ago, 1,000,000 years ago, going further and further back. Because while it is fascinating, clearly, both to adults and children, especially to children, but it's certainly fascinating and interesting to imagine. And while especially today we can paint very vivid pictures of what our discoveries made with forensic methods and scientific reasoning reveal to us, there is a little bit of an element of, well, but is this just for entertainment or does it serve some other purpose? Meaning, if you didn't know those things, would you make different decisions in the present day? Like, well, I was going to make Kiddush, or I was going to lend a helping hand to someone in need, or I was going to resist the urge to murder someone, or what have you. But now, because I learned that tens of millions of years ago there were giant reptiles, I'll do something different. It doesn't make sense, right? Except perhaps in an existential way, where you could say, if somehow someone didn't realize or didn't believe that about the world, and then you suddenly showed them all of this evidence of it, maybe it would just be very disturbing and revolutionary to their whole worldview and thinking, and it could shake a lot of the foundations accordingly. But so I think that's kind of the first question is, does it matter at all to talk about dinosaurs from the standpoint of Torah, or is it just kind of not a topic that's clearly on the surface there because it's just not what we need to engage with? We should be concerned with other questions and other issues. And this is, a sideshow that may be fascinating and may indeed be something you can establish as true according to certain methods of raking through evidence of the past, but maybe it doesn't matter other than as that kind of sideshow form of entertainment. But I think there's a different question that is related to this one, which is it really something that we could ignore completely, even if we didn't think it was very useful to talk about it? And what I mean by that is that there are certain things that are just part of the human experience. They're part of the world, even before you approach them as a scientist, even before you start digging around and developing theories and making assumptions that allow you to develop ideas that are very rich about, what may have happened millions of years ago, right? Because you have to make all sorts of assumptions to do that. You have to have carbon dating or whatever. You have to have methods that let you date the fossil record, which assumes things about how the universe works, which are very reasonable on the one hand, but on the other hand, are nonetheless assumptions. So, before you even get into all of that work, there's just the mere fact of you're walking along in any place in the world that has rocks in it, perhaps, and you're a human being at any particular point in the history of humankind. You don't need to be an expert in anything. You don't have to have special technology. You don't need to have special theories. And maybe you trip over a rock and you notice that it's cracked open and it happens to have little kind of images of familiar sea creatures that kind of look like things that you saw at the beach, except now this is inside a rock up on a mountain somewhere where you're hiking, right? That has basically always been part of the human experience as far as we know, even before any notion of modern science, before the idea of theorizing according to the methodologies of modern science about what might have happened a long time ago. You couldn't totally stick your head in the sand and ignore the fact that there are these things that you can find in the world that kind of look like animals or bones of animals or pieces of things that you see that are sometimes alive, except maybe they're in the wrong place. Like they might be up near the, at a high altitude where there doesn't seem like there are sea creatures there, or it might be they're the wrong size. Like, oh, this looks like the skeletal head of a reptile, which I've seen before, except it's a whole lot bigger than anything I've seen before. And obviously, we see a lot more evidence of this kind now that we look for it carefully. But I don't think that you can say that it's something that just never was part of the human experience and never should have been. And in that sense, it's very much like, we had a previous show and discussion about primates, right? Like apes and whether human beings are descended from apes. Even if you don't want to talk about the question of the descent of man, apes are a lot like people, right? They have opposable thumbs on hands with 5 fingers. And they have faces that in many cases remind us of our own, and they're very intelligent in certain ways. They have behaviors that remind us of our own behaviors. So you don't need to think about the past in order to feel confronted with questions about the difference between human beings and animals when you encounter primates like monkeys and especially apes. So there's that. And then I think in the same way we can say there's something about fossils that you can't totally avoid confronting as a part of the created world, even if you view it in those terms, right? Even if you're saying the world I encounter is the world that Kadosh Baruch Hu made for me to experience, it's very pat and simplistic, and I think not looking for much in terms of implications for human experience and choice. If we just say, oh, well, it's all there to test our faith, the Torah doesn't mention this stuff, so the fact that we see it means that we should somehow believe it doesn't matter and forget about it as a sign of our emunah. Maybe that works for some, but I think as with many kinds of solutions of that sort to challenges presented when we find tensions between our experience of the world and the Torah, it doesn't ask much of us intellectually, and it can be stultifying, and I would argue cause us to miss opportunities for discovering Torah that we should be learning and understanding and studying, so that we can get a deeper perspective on our mission as Ovdei Hashem, right? So with all of that being said as a preamble, what I want to do is just first, there are a lot of sources for today, and we're not going to read through all of them, but I want to just first lay out different places that we might think if the Torah were going to play with the topic of dinosaurs and fossils and things like that, where would it be doing that, and how can we start to knit that together into some kind of commentary? So we're working with the premise that maybe there is something that the Torah has to tell us about this part of the human experience, because it is a little weird to find things that look like seashells inside rocks at mountaintops. And if that's the case, then it may cause us to ask questions about what the world is and where it came from and what happened before we were here. And if we're going to compare that to what the Torah teaches us, then maybe the Torah has a comment to make to us about whether its account should be expected to conform to what we infer from that kind of evidence or not. So a few different sources in rapid fire. Probably the most famous one is very early on in the creation of the world, in the 6 days of creation of Maaseh Bereshit. You have specific mention of Taninim Hagdolim, the great sea monsters, it is sometimes translated, or the mighty serpents, which are in the sea. They're described as swimming in the sea, and that they rule over the waters, right? But the important thing here is that unlike many of the other things, basically everything else except human beings, and if we're talking about all the other animals in the world, the verb to create is not used when describing the creation of other living things, plants and animals. But here with Taninim Hagdolim, it says, Vayivra Elohim et Taninim Hagdolim ve'et kol nefesh haya haromeset asher shartzu hamayim liminehem ve'et kol of kanaf liminehu vayar Elohim kitov. So we have mention simultaneously of birds and sea reptiles of some kind, and we have to establish elsewhere what a tanin really is. But there's a special incidence of the verb vayivra, which is used for, Bereshit bara Elohim et hashamayim et haaretz. So the creation of heaven and earth gets that verb, and also the creation of humankind gets a use of the word of the root bet resh aleph, which is bara. But other creatures don't, except for the Taninim. And so that's kind of a demarcation that says, oh, that's a little interesting. It's kind of dafka, or on purpose, trying to tell you that Hashem made this. And it almost kind of counterposes itself to the supposition that if it weren't telling you this, you might have been like, oh, I don't know what's going on here. Because if I found evidence of these things, I'm not sure that I would believe perhaps that they were created by Hashem. So that's a first source, but it's a very faint voice on its own. But great reptiles is something that makes us think about dinosaurs. And I would add that also, because of what I mentioned before about seashells in geologic layers that are no longer anywhere near water, the idea of the sea as the unfathomable depths, which have very peculiar kind of association with fossil record things, and the notion of some kind of great destruction that might have happened in the past that could have led to all of these creatures we never see now somehow being stuck in rock. I think that the association with the sea is interesting as well. It's also interesting that it's associated in this pasuk with birds, since birds scientifically are what we now think of as being descended from dinosaurs. And honestly, that's not a total stretch, in the sense that bird skeletons and some of these fossilized dinosaur skeletons are also similar enough that maybe they do belong in that package deal. But still, it's a very faint voice, this first source. Next source, scrolling down, I am on the one hand going to say, so we have an opportunity to chase down the idea of the Tanin, and we're about to dive into that, because that's going to be the thread that we pull on, where we try to start making sense of this. But I just want to mention a few other things that maybe, if we were just making a brainstorm or a bulletin board of ideas, which don't seem at all connected to this at first, there are a few other things that I'd mentioned. So there's the war of the four kings versus the 5 kings, where the kings of Sodom and Amorah at some point fall into pits of tar, which is, again, that doesn't make you think of dinosaurs, but it is a little bit, the idea of a living thing falling into tar there are places in the world that give you that kind of geologic evidence of animals that are stuck in now kind of fossilized sort of mineral that used to be tar, but that's like even a weaker voice. But I'm just listing things that you might have put up as just brainstorming, right? So another one is the wife of Lot, which is actually also associated with Sdom, that when she looks back at the destruction of Sdom, she turns to a Netziv Melach, a pillar of salt. So that is interesting because it's a mineral remnant of a living creature. And again, not very strongly establishing that it has any connection to these ideas. It's very weak on its own, but it is an example we have in the narrative where we have the idea of a living creature turning to some kind of mineral remnant of itself. And then, interestingly, in that same moment, what's happening to Sdom? Sdom is getting destroyed with fire raining from the sky. So I will admit the idea of fire raining from the sky is not something that a lay person at any time in human history could, look at fossils and immediately guess at, like, oh, I wonder what happened to this giant reptile that now is just kind of a rock shaped like a giant reptile. Oh, it must have been fire raining from the sky. However, it is true that with things like volcanic eruptions, famously in Pompeii with Mount Vesuvius, which is actually in the Mediterranean, you can have these kind of mineral-looking, human-shaped remnants of living things that are caught in a volcanic eruption, which certainly involves fire raining from the sky. And other kinds of fire raining from the sky are also just a very natural thing. If you're aware of the possibility of meteors and things like that, because you've seen them and you know their destructive potential, you're certainly going to think of that as a possibility when you say, what could possibly have overthrown a world ruled by these great and mighty creatures? So that might be on your short list, because that is the ultimate emblem of totally uncontrollable and unpredictable divine wrath. And so that would be another source that I would point to. And then, of course, there's all the stuff about Leviathan, right? Elsewhere in Tanakh, we have this idea of the ultimate sort of sea monster reptile. Maybe it's a fish, maybe it's a snake. There are different things that make it sound like either. But it's some kind of sea snake dragon monster that is referred to in Sefer Eov and in Tehillim, and also in Sefer Yeshayahu. So the Leviathan is referred to in various places, but that certainly is the idea of this ultimate reptile. And I think if you were being very, if you were trying to be very archaeological in how you thought about the language used in Tanakh and the idea of Leviathan and its function, and why the idea of a giant reptile was an emblem that could enter the poetry of Tanakh and speak to a generation in the ancient world, you would say that, well, where do people get this idea of, giant reptilian monsters that rule the world that are sort of like hidden in the sea or something? So that is something that could be very deep in human consciousness since a long time ago, from stomping around and every so often encountering something that does look like a little stone-shaped piece of a dinosaur next to a seashell or whatever. I know that you wouldn't actually see that geologically, but you get the idea. So, so those are different sources, and I think if you just lay them all out, they seem like, okay, that doesn't really prove anything, and it seems a very eclectic mix of different things that have nothing to do with each other. So how are we supposed to pull them all together? And I wouldn't say that I had the intention of trying to pull them all together, but what I would like to share is that I think there's a thread you can pull on here, which does pull them all together in kind of a remarkable way that I marvel at to some degree, but I think it's certainly still eclectic and obscure in some sense, the point it's trying to make. But I'll try to pull together some other sources at the end where I can make a comment on that. So now we go to the appearance of Tanin, the maybe crocodile, maybe serpent, some kind of reptile that references Hataninim Hagdolim, the big serpents that were created with this verb bara at the creation of the world. So they next appear when we get to Aharon HaKohen, when he goes with Moshe Rabbeinu to Paro. So when Moses and Aaron are going to Pharaoh, and they are performing signs before Paro to begin the conversation with him about how Kadosh Baruch Hu is the creator of the world, and he demands that the Egyptians, the Mitzrim, release from slavery his people. And so there's this demonstration, which is reminiscent of a sign given to Moshe with his staff, his mateh, which turned into a nachash, but it is not the same thing. Why? Because the word is different here. Aaron is told to take his mateh, his staff, and throw it on the ground, and it will become, as it does become, a tanin. So Aaron throws his mateh on the ground before Paro. It becomes a tanin, and then Paro is going to take his hartumim, his magicians, and try to duplicate the same sign. And so they do the same thing. It says, "Vayashlichu ish matehu, vayehiyu letaninim, vayivla mateh Aaron et matotam." So each cast down his rod, and they turned into serpents or crocodiles, or however you're going to translate that word. But Aaron's rod swallowed their rods. Now, there's a lot in this source, and it's you can take it in different directions. The only thing I want to grab onto and move on is just we've just brought in with the idea of Tanin. We pulled on the thread of Tanin, and we brought in the idea of Aharon, a Kohen, who's the father of the Levitical priesthood. So that's the other element of the title of this talk. His mateh, his staff, is involved in this. And also, I'm going to flag the verb vayivla, the word to swallow, bala'ah, beit lamed ayin, as something that we're going to be looking for elsewhere. So those are just pieces of data attached to this source, and the source still doesn't explain much to us about what the Taninim Gdolim in creation were, and what is, I haven't made any point about what this has to do with Paro or why Aaron is doing this, but we're just going to follow this all the way through to, all right, where else is Mateh Aaron really important? Where is the staff of Aaron important? The staff of Aaron is important at the moment when the subset of Bnei Israel that are rebelling against Moshe and Aaron have proven to them the election of Shevet Levi and Aaron for the special role of service in the Mishkan and the Mikdash. So there's this rebellion led by Korach, who is a Levi from he's from Bnei Kahat. So he's from the part of the Levites who are descended from Kahat. And he makes this accusation to Moshe that all the people are Kedoshim, and that it is too much that has been kind of grabbed by the Levites, perhaps, or at least by the Kehunah, by the priesthood, and taken for themselves. And so Korach is leading this kind of egalitarian rebellion, saying that we shouldn't be making these distinctions and separating the Kedusha for the priesthood, or perhaps for the Levites, even because the whole nation is Kadosh. So he has this misunderstanding of Kedusha that leads him to this political rebellion. And various things happen there that are interesting. I'll start with the thing at the end, which is that eventually there's this sign, or maybe I shouldn't call it an oath, but there's a sign given that Aharon is chosen, because there's this demonstration where they all the different leaders of the different tribes lay their staffs down, and the staff of Aharon flowers with shkedim, with the flowers of almonds. And so normally when you lay down a staff on the ground, it doesn't sprout as though it's still a living thing. So it's a non-living staff that becomes alive, and it becomes alive with almond blossoms. And that signifies the selection of Aharon. And you could ask why almond blossoms. There are lots of different ways to go with that. There are lots of almond blossoms in the Mishkan, like in the cups of the menorah that Aaron lights, which is the lamp, or also I believe on the bells that are with the rimonim on the bottom of the vestments of Kohen Gadol, but I may be making that mistake. But so there is our association of almonds with Kehunah and the priesthood, but that just kind of begs the question: why almonds? Living in Eretz Yisrael in this exact season, it is notable that shkediot, like almond trees, they flower first. There's a song in modern Hebrew about the holiday of Tu B'Shvat that begins Hashkedia Porachat. The almond tree is flowering, and that's the beginning of the spring season where it gets warm enough and sunny enough that flowers start to bloom. And this is the fruiting tree that first flowers. So there's this idea of first flowering or earliness that we could bring in. I mean, we'll probably want to go back to that, but that's just at the moment not yet converging at all on the idea of dinosaurs, unless you're really stretch, because you say, okay, they came first maybe, but you get dinosaurs and their historical priorness from almonds. I'm not sure that you can push it that far. However, if we look elsewhere at the same moment when there's this rebellion of Korach, we've already said now Korach is this moment where the staff of Aharon matters a lot. What else matters in Korach? Well, another thing that happens is that Moshe makes this declaration, this very strange declaration that is trying to prove that the people who are rebelling with Korach are wrong. And the way he says that is he says, Ve'im bri'a yivra Adonai ufatzta ha'adama et piha uvala'a otam ve'et kol asher lahem ve'yardu hayim she'ola ve'yeda'atem ki na'asu ha'anashim ha'ele et Adonai. So he's saying, if Hashem brings about, and the verb here is bri'a yivra, so if Hashem will surely create this opening of the earth's mouth, then these people fall in and go down to Sheol, which is the unknown, Hayim, alive. Then you will know that these people have spurned Hashem, and then that he has therefore demonstrated what he thinks about that. And scarcely had he spoken, and the ground opens and they're swallowed up. So what do we have here? Well, we have already said we have the Mateh of Aaron, like we had with the turning into the Tanin, right? We had the Tanin with the staff of Aaron. What else do we have besides the staff of Aaron here? We have Bria Yivra, we have this verb, Bet Resh Aleph, creation, like in the beginning of the world. We also have the idea of the earth opening its mouth and something descending into oblivion or unknown oblivion, whole and alive into the earth, which is this very evocative image of a living thing kind of not dying and decomposing in the normal way, which is even something that Moshe refers to right before this passage that's quoted here, but instead descending into the earth alive, as though you looked at a piece of the earth sometime and you saw like a whole living creature just sort of preserved there in a way that doesn't necessarily always happen, right? Because the usual way of dying is for you to totally decompose and disappear, so that old bones even eventually are not really in such good shape anymore. But if they somehow get turned into part of the earth and into stone, then they can stick around for a long time. And we have, the verb, bala'ah. We have bet lamed ayin. So we also have swallowing. Thinking back to Aaron Kohen throwing down his staff with Paro and the Tanin, with the reptile. There we had swallowing and the staff and the reptile. And the reptile was the one that was nivra, it was created with the verb bara. So here we have the verb bara, we have swallowing, we have the image of a living thing being trapped in the earth, we have the staff of Aharon, and we also, well, I think we can get back to the question of whether we find interesting the idea of the almonds being about flowering first. But in any case, I think that this source compared back against those two other ones, it starts, for me at least, to be difficult to just say, nah, this all has nothing to do with anything. It starts to be that this is speaking to part of the human experience and how we encounter sometimes evidence of previously living things that seem to be sort of part of the ground or part of the earth. And yet also narratively, and with these specific signs in the text, we're seeing that these passages are somehow connected to each other. And it all seems to revolve around now this moment where the authenticity of the selection of Shevet Levi for service in the temple and for the priesthood is the most apparent. So that is the weird part right now, because I think we know that Aaron is associated with his staff and with the Tanin, and then we see Aaron as this person from Shevet Levi coming back to us, and it's fitting together at the level of objective data, but the meaning of it or the purpose of that, why the Torah is talking about this, I think is still very much unclear. What does this have to do with any of the other things that we might wonder about dinosaurs, and why should it be connected at all to the story or the discussion of the selection of Shevet Levi? So I apologize that the sources on the sheet might be a little out of order, so I'm going to have to ask to scroll down to see what's coming up next. Okay, so here I want to present just last evidence. I mentioned the Leviathan before, so now we have another thing to realize, because we mentioned Leviathan before just because in a sense it was the most dinosaur-like thing we could think of that's explicitly mentioned in Tanakh. But where does the name Leviathan come from? It's just there in Tanakh. It's quoted as a thing that is a scary big reptile. And it even here in the source from Yeshayahu and Navi is explicitly conflated with a Tanin. So it's both conflated with being Nachash and also Tanin. And so it is a sea serpent. It's described in different terms. It's quite a scary monster. But you both have Leviathan and also Tanin. And notice also now that we're focusing on, all right, what were we talking about just now? We were talking about Tanin, which sounds almost like Tanim. Nin can in Hebrew be a pluralization, or at least it's a nasal sound, the nun, which is very much like mem. So Tanim or Tanin, it evokes the root in that word of being tan, right? Now tan doesn't actually mean a reptile in Hebrew, but and Tanim actually is a famous word for other reasons, talking about the Mikdash and this passage in the Gemara where Rabbi Akiva is laughing, but we can leave that for another time. In any case, the idea of Tanin or Tanim, it makes us think of Tan because of the grammar of Hebrew, and then we look at Leviathan, and it's a Levi and Tan. It's a word that's built out of a reference to Shevet Levi on the one hand. Lamed Vav Yud is not something you see in a lot of places. Okay, that's not all over the place in lots of different words. Especially in Tanakh, there are verbs that also give you that. Maybe not with a Yud, but malwe or malve means to loan. So you do have Lamed Vav at least appearing elsewhere, but Lamed Vav Yud, that's Levi. And then Tan is reference to this Tanin that appears in the same pasuk right next to it. So you would never have seen the word Leviathan and said, oh, you know what I think that means? I think that really this is some kind of Leviathan. Like it's of course there are different Taninim or reptiles, but this is like the super reptile, and so it's the Levi reptile, and that's a reference to Shevet Levi for some reason, because somehow anything to do with dinosaur-like reptiles, we have to involve Shevet Levi. But we just proved that from totally separate sources in Chumash, in the 5 books of Moses, and then suddenly we come back to this idea of Leviathan, which means whale in modern Hebrew, but is in Tanakh referring to this reptile, and it's there plain as day. There's Levi and Tan. So again, that still doesn't tell us why, but it's more data that we're collecting for this discussion. So if we can go down to the next source, which is, I think I'll skip over this one actually, because this is just saying, and it's another mention of Leviathan in Tanakh. This is where we now can start to try to pull things together a little bit and say, why would these two things be associated? Because up until now, we've just been establishing from the word about swallowing and from the idea of Aaron and the Levitical priesthood and his staff and the almond flowers flowering early and being created with the verb bara, with all these different pieces of objective data trying to show that these things are correlated and related, but it didn't mean anything yet in the sense of, okay, so we're of the Hashem, what is HaKadosh Baruch Hu trying to teach us? What should we take from this? How do we understand ourselves and our role in the world differently, and what the Torah means differently because of this. So now we have to go to the other side. So there are a few other sources. You'll know that this is a source that is connected with stone. I'm going to eventually bring in stone. So I said before, I mentioned stone, like fire raining from the sky, a human being or living thing turning into a mineral remnant of itself. And those just sounded like random things that a little bit remind you of dinosaurs. But we're actually going to see that stone now gets pulled into this swirling maelstrom because there are a bunch of different kings that go to war in the time of Avraham Avinu, including the king of Sdom, Bera, and of Amorah, Bersha. But there are 5 kings in all that get kidnapped and conquered by Amraphel and Arioch and Kedorlaomer. So the 4 kings who come and attack the 5 kings. But what's funny, always bothered me about this source is that the 5 kings, when they're listed, everyone is listed as there was King Bera of Sdom and King Bersha of Amorah. You have 5 kings, and each king is listed with what they're the king of. And then it just says at the end, Umelech Bela Hitzor. It suddenly changes, it breaks the pattern. It says the king of Bela, and it now refers to the place or the city Bela and gives it another name. It says, Bela, you know, that place that's also called Zoar. So it doesn't tell you the name of the king, which is kind of curious. And I never had an idea of why that would be, why you wouldn't name the king of Bela, until I was looking for a way of understanding this Leviathan thing. And it suddenly struck me that there's another king in this story whose name we do learn, who is not mentioned in this list, but he does appear later. So if we go down to the next source. So, okay. So this source was just mentioning Bela again, and again, the king of Bela, and which is Zoar. You have a repetition of that word. The other thing I was going to mention is obviously Bela is Bet Lamed Aleph, so it's that root Bala, like swallowing. So that's why we're pulling on this thread, because now that gets us into stone. Like we said, stone was random things that reminded us of fossils and dinosaurs, but we also have this root about Bala, to swallow, like the earth swallowed these living things. That's being associated with stone also now, and so it's starting to seem like, okay, maybe there's data there, but if we came now to the text with that theory, what we would be saying is, all right, so if this is supposed to have to do with what we were already building up about dinosaurs coming from the direction of the Tanin, then yes, it's interesting that there's fire raining from the sky, which could be a volcano that makes, mineral silhouettes or ashen silhouettes of living things, or which could be, or yes, it's interesting that someone turns into a pillar of salt, which is like a mineral remnant of a living thing. And yes, we remember the kings of stone falling into tar pits, but those are all kind of one-off things that each stand separately. But if we were to claim that this has to do with the Leviathan data, then we want it to be connected thematically and textually to that, right? So it needs to also be about the words that appear there. So now we found one, Bed Lamed Aleph, Bed Lamed Ain, which is Bara, the swallowing. The other thing that came up more than once and was in this kind of central text with Korach was the staff of Aharon and the idea of choosing the priesthood, choosing Aharon and the Levim, Shevet Levi, for the priesthood. So that's another thing that we could be looking for. And then the question is whether the word bara, like creation, really stands on its own, or whether it's a reference to the Tanin. So can we get some more of these things to come out of this text? So we have this root bara. So now if we pull on that, where does it get us to? Well, at the end of this war, when Avraham saves Lot and also the people of Sdom and various other parties from Kedorlaomer, we now have this kind of ritual celebration that gets led afterwards in this very curious passage where out of nowhere comes this guy, Malki Tzedek Melech Shalem, Hotzi Lechem Vayain, Vehu Kohen Le'el Elyon. So he is Melchizedek, the king of Shalem, brought out bread and wine, and he was the priest of Hakadosh Baruch Hu, we learn elsewhere in our tradition that El Elyon is the one and the same, and really we can get that from here because Avraham speaks of El Elyon as though he is identified with the God that Avraham worships. And so Melchizedek, who is both a king and a priest, makes this blessing. He blesses Avraham, he blesses Hakadosh Baruch Hu. He brings bread and wine. It's kind of a kiddush that he leads. And I don't think that you could argue this strongly without the other evidence we've been trying to pile up, but I would go back, and now what I want to suggest is this unnamed king of Bela, which is the place that Lot ultimately flees to. Perhaps this unnamed king of Bela is Melchizedek. I'm not even sure you have to say that, but he is another king who wasn't named previously, who just shows up. And why is he here? What does he have to do with what's going on? We have midrashim that tell us things that everyone knows about Melchizedek, which is that he was Shem, he was the son of Noah. And so he represents some kind of continuity of connection to the time of Noah, to this generation. But we're not getting that from the text of the Torah itself. And midrashim, we should read them looking for what they're trying to teach us, like what point they're trying to make, not just here's most miscellaneous additional facts that were not recorded in the main text. So we can talk for a second about that, about Melchizedek being Shem, and what that could mean. But I want to pull on the text of the Torah itself and say, what is the kind of the evidence that Melchizedek might be playing that role? Well, the idea of Shem is the notion that there has always been an authentic and kasher or correct relationship with HaKadosh Baruch Hu that humankind has had, going back to Adam HaRishon, down through Shet, down through all the different ones that got it right, to Noah, and then through Shem from Noah down to Avraham. And so it isn't Shem per se just as a let's say archaeological claim. It's Shem as the idea of an everlasting connection tracing all the way back to Gan Eden between mankind and HaKadosh Baruch Hu, where it was possible to be a properly religious monotheist before Avraham, perhaps in some sense. And there may be some sense in which, therefore, Avraham was actually carrying forward a tradition. He was unique and he started something new. And in a sense, he's a singularity. But, Terach, his father, was on his way to Canaan, the Torah tells us. So there's a sense in which his father started what Avraham finished. And so we also see elements of that. And that would explain how it's possible that in this world there's a priest of some God that actually, is being named in a way we subsequently find out from Avraham and elsewhere. Really, we're talking about Hashem here, that there's a priest who can lead worship of Hashem in a way that is somehow accessible to a whole crowd of people, including Avraham. But I think what makes it possible that it's associated with Bela is just the idea that Lot eventually flees to Bela. So if Lot were fleeing Sodom, where would he go first? He would go to the closest place that somehow felt safer to him because the people there were okay. He knew them. They were the people who maybe shared some faith with his family. And so I would want to go to Shalem, right? I would want to go to Melchizedek if I could do that. So there's a possibility maybe that this unnamed king of Bela is Melchizedek. And I find it interesting because specifically Bela is given another name, which is Zohar. Zohar it's Tzadi Ayin Reish, so it's like the word Tza'ir, which means young. And young is like, that it's when things are young, they are at the beginning of their growth and development. So they're showing their earliest development. And what we're seeing here with the priesthood of Melchizedek is kind of the earliest development of proper priestly worship of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's what we're being shown by the Torah, is some notion that this existed in Canaan in a way that predates Avraham or entangles with him or has to do with him. So now, in rapid fire, a few more sources, and we have a little discussion. I think that the rest of this, I kind of just want to make my point without evidence, and then I'll try to point to a bit of what I think is the evidence for it, and then we can close. I will admit that this is not going to be the most forceful proof of an interpretation that you can put together, because I think we're in very speculative territory, but I think it's interesting. So what can we say about this? Melchizedek, king of Shalem, the Midrash tells us not only that he was Shem, but also that Shalem is the latter half of the word Yerushalayim, and that Yerushalayim, there's a source here in the source sheet for this, that Yerushalayim was called what it was for two reasons. Because Hashem called Har Moriah, the Temple Mount, Hashem Yireh, he named it after the binding of Isaac, with this word Yireh, which is either connected with seeing or with awe. And then Yireh, Shalem becomes Yerushalayim. But what it says at that time, in the source a bit further down, is that when Melchizedek, in the source we just read, blessed Abraham first, and then HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that he made a mistake. And for that, he lost the right to be the father of the priesthood. That in some sense, beforehand, he had deserved to lead the priesthood that would serve Hashem. But that was ripped away from him because he blessed man first before Hashem, and that was the wrong order. And so therefore, there was this kind of progenitor or pre-existing priestly lineage that ended and was cut off, and then it was replaced by something new. And the new thing that came along was Shevet Levi, the descendants of Abraham through Yaakov and through Levi. So when that gets said, so there are different things you could make out of that commentary from Chazal, from the sages. But I think one thing that we need to grab onto is just the idea of what is the point of saying this? Why talk about this at all? What does it even mean to say that he was, that Shalem, or sorry, that Melchizedek or Shem was going to be the father of the lineage of priesthood, but that it was taken away from him? And what does that signify to us about how we understand kihuna, how we understand the priesthood, and what its role is? And I think that we can even see some other evidence that's related to this passage where the text is maybe winking at this same idea as well, because the other place that the word Shalem appears is in this pasuk further down, where it's in Brit Ben HaBetarim. It's in the covenant between the halves that Abraham makes. You passed it. Just back up. Right. This the one that begins with number 16, right above this. So HaKadosh Baruch Hu was saying to Abraham that his children are going to have to go down to Mitzrayim and be there for a long time. V'dor revi'i yashuvu hena ki lo shalem avon ha'emori ad hena. So there's this idea that the iniquity or the wickedness of some people that will be bad in the future, the emori, has not yet reached that point, and so they don't deserve to be dispossessed and conquered yet. So Abraham has to kind of bide his time, and his descendants have to kind of wait 400 years or whatever it's going to be, so they can come back and deserve the land because the people in it deserve to be kicked out of it. Or at least that's a simple reading of this. But the word shalem, which means complete in this context, is quoted here. And it is interesting also that the word avon appears there at the same time, because what is shalem and avon? So this is maybe very too much of a stretch, but I think it is a way you could argue that this is how Chazal are getting Shem from Melchizedek Melech Shalem. Why? Because if you take Shem and Avon and you put them together, it's Shimon, right? And who is Shimon? Shimon is the older brother who comes before Levi, right? So Levi is the tribe that ultimately inherits the priesthood. But in principle, there's a Ben Bechor, which is Reuven, and then there's also Shimon, who's older than Levi. And both of them had to, in some sense, be passed over in order for Levi to be the one to inherit the priesthood. So Shem plus Avon here would make Shimon, which references an older brother who precedes Levi that is being sort of cut off or passed over. And it's also the place where the word Shalem is appearing, in Melchi Tzedek, Melech Shalem. So that is, far too intricate to be proof of anything, but I can't help but notice the possibility there. And in any case, I think what it just underlines is this idea in general that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is doing things in his time, that he's preparing Canaan for the descendants of Avraham Avinu, but it's not prepared yet, and not because Hashem can't make it be what he wants when he wants it. It's because he wants there to be a historical development. He wants there to be a process. He wants there to be a past that comes before, and that takes a lot of time, because that becomes the foundation for what the world is, and it becomes the world in which the rest of what it's going to play out happens. So he wants to do things by the methods by which they happen when you do them naturally in a world that has the natural laws that he wanted it to have. And so, yes, of course, he could just obliterate all the people or make them not exist or make them very sinful right now so they deserve to be obliterated in all of Canaan. But he's not doing that. He's letting the Emori in their time come to deserve, as he knows they will, to be displaced. But until they're displaced, it's not ready. And I think that idea actually is what helps us to land on what we're thinking about with Shem and Levi, and maybe also then going back to this idea of Leviathan and the dinosaurs. Because I think that what happens now is you flip it around. What the idea of primordial, ancient, scary reptiles that may have existed and been very sort of great and mighty, but now all we see are these remnants of them, and they're not mighty at all. They've been flung down. It's the ultimate idea of there being something that came before that could have had a towering height of power and significance, and still somehow it couldn't last, right? And that something else that HaKadosh Baruch Hu intends to be better, to come along to replace it, that was what had to come along. And so it was in its natural time the case that this thing wouldn't last despite its great might and significance. And so you can be a person walking along, seeing living things that seemed towering and mighty, and now encased in stone and like they don't matter anymore. And it's going to provoke you a profound contemplation, both of what came before that I don't know, and also how great what came before may have once been, but now it is lost and can be lost. And was that a freak occurrence? Was that a purposelessness in the world where sometimes things just fall down and there's no point to it or no meaning to it? But I think that by connecting this to the idea of Levi and of the priesthood, what the Torah is perhaps trying to do is to give us the ability to think about the priesthood as being, and also, by extension, the eventual bechira, the eventual choosing of Am Yisrael as Hashem's people, as a historical development that reflects HaKadosh Baruch Hu's intention from the beginning, despite the fact that it had to emerge at a particular time when the particular world that Hashem intended to create had already developed a whole lot and taken time to get ready to become that place and that context that was ready for that moment where things could come into being. So we both have in the Torah the idea that Shevet Levi is a replacement for the Ben Bechor, that the Ben Bechor in some sense should be serving Hashem, but that instead we do Pidyon Ben and the Kohanim are serving Hashem in place of the Bechor. So this idea of the firstborn, he who was born first, who came first, being replaced is an element that fits into this with Shevet Levi. It's also about the almond flower that blossoms first before any of the other blossoms. You don't think about it, but the other stabs of all the tribes could have been blossoming too. It just, if there weren't shkediot, they would have blossomed later, right? Because the shkediot blossoms first. So that there's this idea of priesthood as being somehow connected with early blossoming. And also, there's this idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu has an intention that extends across the entirety of the natural history of the world and human history. And just the same way that to make room for people, perhaps at some point, the great and mighty animals that might have come before had to be shuffled aside. And perhaps by some notion that we need not concern ourselves with, they may have deserved it, but we don't have to ponder that too much because it's not the focus of this text. But similarly with Shem also, and with Am Yisrael and Shevet Levi, this idea of priesthood, of selection to be a mamlechet kohanim, a nation of priests, or selection to be a tribe of priests within the nation of priests, to be priestly to them and to serve in the temple. That in all these cases, the particular moment where these groups are chosen, they are the product of a historical development that comes beforehand and that creates the context in which their birth is possible. And so you can say, in one sense, perhaps it is interesting to imagine what was it like to worship Hashem before the time of Abraham. And the Torah is referencing the idea that perhaps that could be a possibility, that there is a notion of historical development, of knowledge of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that is not the focus of the Torah mainly, and nonetheless is there in the background if you're looking for it. But I'll just close with this last source. We can skip over this, but this is another point that is miscellaneously related to some of what else we were saying. We can keep scrolling down. Sorry. We can skip over that one. So I guess I can't resist with Sefer Yonah. I'll just mention Yonah. He gets thrown into the sea, swallowed by a giant fish. So in this case, it's a giant scary fish, like scaly creature in the water, like a Leviathan. And what does he pray for? He wants to go to the temple. He wants to go see the holy sanctuary in the temple. So it's another just a connection between the temple and giant scary sea creatures. But we can skip over this whole thing, because this is the thing is about Shem having the Kiyonah ripped away from him, and go all the way to the bottom. And the last source that I just wanted to, this is this one from Sefer Eov. This is the last one. So I think in the end, what we can close with is the question of going back to the Leviathan as the emblem for this whole really crazy, weird thing that maybe weaves the idea of dinosaurs together with the idea of when and why the priesthood was selected and what came before them. That I think when Eov is talking, or rather when HaKadosh Baruch Hu is talking to Eov about the Leviathan, he poses questions to him that I think at the end return us to our starting point, are still the essence of the Tanakh's reaction to this contemplation, which is, he says, can you draw out the Leviathan by a fish hook? Can you press down his tongue by a rope? Can you put a ring? I'm just going to read the English because it's a lot to get through. Can you put a ring through his nose or pierce his jaw with a barb? Will he plead with you at length? Will he speak soft words to you? Will he make an agreement with you to be taken as your lifelong slave? Will you play with him like a bird? Tie him down for your girls? Shall traders traffic in him? Going on and on. I think the ultimate point is, why do you want to know this? Right? Why are you asking this question? Think very carefully about your kawana, your intention when you're posing this question, because it is a fascinating question that arouses intense curiosity. Whether you're thinking about an ancient or prehistoric world that's totally different with other animals in it, or whether you're thinking about trying to forensically reconstruct what might have been proto-Judaic monotheism in a way that could have predated Avraham. And this is being referenced by Chazal. This is not something that comes from outside our tradition. Chazal, by saying that Melchizedek is Shem, are pointing, they're nodding at the idea of this. And really, you can see elsewhere in sources we skipped over that Har HaBayit has a similar story with the threshing floor being purchased from Arwana or Arnon, the Yebusi. That actually ties into all of this as well, if you want to go back to it. But I think that the ultimate question that has to be asked here is, why do you want to catch the Leviathan? Why do you want to catch it on your hook? Don't say, well, that would be amazing, and just be fascinated by the mysteriousness and grandeur of it, whether it be thinking about what came before Torah, that was the beginnings of Torah, or the same with Kehuna, with priesthood, or whether it be thinking about the dinosaurs and the natural prehistoric world. You can ask this question, you can make arguments, and you can develop theories, and some of them are really fascinating and interesting. But you should think very carefully about why you are trying to know the answer, and whether knowing the answer does in fact have an impact on how you act. Because I think that there are times when we desire knowledge that we don't necessarily already understand what we're going to use it for in the context of Avodat Hashem. And sometimes maybe it's good to have curiosity, but when you push that throttle all the way up, is curiosity for its own sake something that we do, that we pursue in service of HaKadosh Baruch Hu, or is it in service of our own gratification, like one who has the Leviathan dangling on his hook to entertain or be laid low as a slave? So that is where I'll finish today. I know this was an even more eclectic journey than usual, but it's also a fun one.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. We would also like to suggest the following opportunity to our viewers. If you identify with Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to sponsor or dedicate a video interview with the rabbi in honor or memory of a loved one, if you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org. If you are inspired by Rabbi Bar-Hayim's message and would like to get involved in Torah Eretz Yisrael activities in your local area, please fill out the relevant form by going to the link which appears on the screen.